As he led the tribe down to the river in the dim light of dawn, Moonwatcher paused uncertainly at a familiar spot. Something he knew was missing, but what it was, he could not remember. He wasted no mental effort on the problem, for this morning he had more important matters on his mind. Like thunder and lightning and clouds and eclipses, the great block of crystal had departed as mysteriously as it had come, having vanished into the non-existent past. It never troubled Moonwatcher's thoughts again. He would never know what it had done to him, and none of his companions wondered, as they gathered round him in the morning mist, why he had paused for a moment here on the way to the river, from their side of the stream, in the never-violated safety of their own territory. The others first saw Moonwatcher and a dozen males of his tribe as a moving frieze against the dawn sky. At once they began to scream their daily challenge, but this time there was no answer. Steadily, purposefully above, all silently, Moonwatcher and his band descended the low hillock that overlooked the river, and as they approached, the others became suddenly quiet. Their ritual rage ebbed away, to be replaced by a mounting fear. They were dimly aware that something had happened, and that this encounter was unlike all those that had ever gone before. The bone clubs and knives that Moonwatcher's group carried did not alarm them, for they did not understand their purpose. They only knew that their rivals' movements were now imbued with determination and with menace. The party stopped at the water's edge, and for a moment the others' courage revived. Led by One Ear, they half-heartedly resumed their battle chant. It lasted only a few seconds before a vision of terror struck them dumb. Moonwatcher raised his arms high into the air, revealing the burden that until now had been concealed by the hirsute bodies of his companions. He was holding a stout branch, and impaled upon it was the bloody head of the leopard. The mouth had been jammed open with a stick, and the great fangs gleamed a ghastly white in the first rays of the rising sun. Most of the others were too paralyzed with fright to move, but some began a slow, stumbling retreat. That was all the encouragement that Moonwatcher needed. Still holding the mangled trophy above his head, he started to cross the stream. After a moment's hesitation, his companions splashed after him. When Moonwatcher reached the far side, One Ear was still standing his ground. Perhaps he was too brave or too stupid to run. Perhaps he could not really believe that this outrage was actually happening. Coward or hero, it made no difference in the end, as the frozen snarl of death came crashing down upon his uncomprehending head. Shrieking with fright, the others scattered into the bush. But presently they would return, and soon they would forget their lost leader. For a few seconds, Moonwatcher stood uncertainly above his new victim, trying to grasp the strange and wonderful fact that the dead leopard could kill again. Now he was master of the world, and he was not quite sure what to do next, but he would think of something. A new animal was abroad on the planet, spreading slowly out from the African heartland. It was still so rare that a hasty census might have overlooked it. Among the teeming billions of creatures roving over land and sea, there was no evidence, as yet, that it would prosper, or even survive, on this world where so many mightier beasts had passed away. Its fate still wavered in the balance. In the 100,000 years since the crystals had descended upon Africa, the man-apes had invented nothing, but they had started to change, and had developed skills which no other animal possessed. Their bone clubs had increased their reach, and multiplied their strength. They were no longer defenseless against the predators with whom they had to compete. The smaller carnivores they could drive away from their own kills. The larger ones they could at least discourage, and sometimes put to flight. Their massive teeth were growing smaller, for they were no longer essential. The sharp-edged stones that could be used to dig out roots, or to cut and saw through tough flesh or fiber, had begun to replace them with immeasurable consequences. No longer were the man-apes faced with starvation when their teeth became damaged or worn. Even the crudest tools could add many years to their lives. And as their fangs diminished, the shape of their face started to alter. The snout receded. The massive jaw became more delicate, the mouth able to make more subtle sounds. Speech was still a million years away, but the first steps toward it had been taken. And then the world began to change. In 4 great waves, with 200,000 years between their crests, the ice ages swept by, leaving their mark on all the globe. Outside the tropics, the glaciers slew those who had prematurely left theft ancestral home, and everywhere, they winnowed out the creatures who could not adapt. When the ice had passed, so had much of the planet's early life, including the man-apes. But, unlike so many others, they had left descendants. They had not merely become extinct, they had been transformed. The tool makers had been remade by their own tools, for in using clubs and flints, their hands had developed a dexterity found nowhere else in the animal kingdom, permitting them to make still better tools, which in turn had developed their limbs and brains yet further. It was an accelerating, cumulative process, and at its end was man. The first true men had tools and weapons, only a little better than those of their ancestors a million years earlier, but they could use them with far greater skill. And somewhere in the shadowy centuries that had gone before, they had invented the most essential tool of all, though it could be neither seen nor touched. They had learned to speak, and so had won their first great victory over time. Now the knowledge of one generation could be handed on to the next, so that each age could profit from those that had gone before. Unlike the animals, who knew only the present, man had acquired a past, and he was beginning to grope toward a future. He was also learning to harness the forces of nature. With the taming of fire, he had laid the foundations of technology and left his animal origins far behind. Stone gave way to bronze, and then to iron. Hunting was succeeded by agriculture. The tribe grew into the village into the town. Speech became eternal, thanks to certain marks on stone and clay and papyrus. Presently he invented philosophy and religion, and he peopled the sky, not altogether inaccurately, with gods. As his body became more and more defenseless, so his means of offense became steadily more frightful. With stone and bronze and iron and steel, he had run the gamut of everything that could pierce and slash, and quite early in time he had learned how to strike down his victims from a distance. The spear, the bow, the gun, and finally the guided missile had given him weapons of infinite range and all but infinite power. Without those weapons, often though he had used them against himself, man would never have conquered his world. Into them he had put his heart and soul, and for ages they had served him well. But now, as long as they existed, he was living on borrowed time. No matter how many times you left Earth, Dr. Haywood Floyd told himself, the excitement never really palled. He had been to Mars once, to the Moon 3 times, and to the various space stations, more often than he could remember. Yet, as the moment of takeoff approached, he was conscious of a rising tension, a feeling of wonder and awe. Yes, and of nervousness, which put him on the same level as any Earth-lubber about to receive his first baptism of space. The jet that had rushed him here from Washington, after that midnight briefing with the President, was now dropping down toward one of the most familiar, yet most exciting landscapes in all the world. There lay the first 2 generations of the space age, spanning 20 miles of the Florida coast to the south. Outlined by winking red warning lights were the giant gantries of the Saturns and Neptunes that had set men on the path to the planets, and had now passed into history. Near the horizon, a gleaming silver tower bathed in floodlights, stood the last of the Saturn V's, for almost 20 years, a national monument and place of pilgrimage. Not far away, looming against the sky like a man-made mountain, was the incredible bulk of the Vehicle Assembly Building, still the largest single structure on Earth. But these things now belonged to the past, and he was flying toward the future. As they banked, Dr. Floyd could see below him a maze of buildings, then a great airstrip, then a broad dead scar across the Fiat Florida landscape, the multiple rails of a giant launch lug track. At its end, surrounded by vehicles and gantries, a spaceplane lay gleaming in a pool of light, being prepared for its leap to the stars. In a sudden failure of perspective, brought on by his swift changes of speed and height, it seemed to Floyd that he was looking down on a small silver moth, caught in the beam of a flashlight. Then the tiny scurrying figures on the ground brought home to him the real size of the spacecraft. It must have been 200 feet across the narrow V of its wings, and that enormous vehicle, Floyd told himself with some incredulity, yet also with some pride, is waiting for me. As far as he knew, it was the first time that an entire mission had been set up to take a single man to the moon. Though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of reporters and cameramen intercepted him on his way to the floodlit Orion 3 spacecraft. He knew several of them by sight, for as chairman of the National Council of Astronautics, the news conference was part of his way of life. This was neither the time nor the place for one, and he had nothing to say. But it was important not to offend the gentlemen of the communications media. Dr. Floyd, I'm Jim Foster of Associated News. Could you give us a few words about this flight of yours? I'm very sorry, I can't say anything. But you did meet with the president earlier this evening, asked a familiar voice. Oh, hello, Mike. I'm afraid you've been dragged out of bed for nothing. Definitely no comment. Can you at least confirm or deny that some kind of epidemic has broken out on the moon? A TV reporter asked, managing to jog alongside and keep Floyd properly framed in his miniature TV camera. Sorry, said Floyd, shaking his head. What about the quarantine? Asked another reporter. How long will it be kept on? Still no comment. Dr. Floyd demanded a very short and determined lady of the press. What possible justification can there be for this total blackout of news from the moon? Has it anything to do with the political situation? What political situation? Floyd asked dryly. There was a sprinkle of laughter, and someone called, Have a good trip, Doctor, as he made his way into the sanctuary of the boarding gantry. As long as he could remember, it had been not a situation so much as a permanent crisis. Since the 1970s, the world had been dominated by two problems, which, ironically, tended to cancel each other out. Though birth control was cheap, reliable, and endorsed by all the main religions, it had come too late. The population of the world was now 6 billion, a third of them in the Chinese Empire. Laws had even been passed in some authoritarian societies, limiting families to 2 children, but their enforcement had proved impracticable. As a result, food was short in every country. Even the United States had meatless days, and widespread famine was predicted within 15 years, despite heroic efforts to farm the sea and to develop synthetic foods. With the need for international cooperation more urgent than ever, there were still as many frontiers as in any earlier age. In a million years, the human race had lost few of its aggressive instincts. Along symbolic lines visible, only 2 politicians, the 38 nuclear powers, watched one another with belligerent anxiety. Among them, they possessed sufficient megatonnage to remove the entire surface crust of the planet. Although there had been, miraculously, no use of atomic weapons, this situation could hardly last forever. And now, for their own inscrutable reasons, the Chinese were offering to the smallest have-not nations a complete nuclear capability of 50 warheads and delivery systems. The cost was under $200 million, and easy terms could be arranged. Perhaps they were only trying to shore up their sagging economy by turning obsolete weapons systems into hard cash, as some observers had suggested. Or perhaps they had discovered methods of warfare so advanced that they no longer had need of such toys. There had been talk of radio hypnosis from satellite transmitters, compulsion viruses, and blackmail by synthetic diseases for which they alone possessed the antidote. These charming ideas were almost certainly propaganda or pure fantasy, but it was not safe to discount any of them. Every time Floyd took off from Earth, he wondered if it would still be there when the time came to return. The trim stewardess greeted him as he entered the cabin. "Good morning, Dr. Floyd. I'm Miss Simmons. I'd like to welcome you aboard on behalf of Captain Tynes and our co-pilot, First Officer Ballard." "Thank you," said Floyd with a smile, wondering why stewardesses always had to sound like robot tour guides. "Takeoff's in 5 minutes," she said, gesturing into the empty 20-passenger cabin. "You can take any seat you want, but Captain Tynes recommends the forward window seat on the left, if you want to watch the docking operations." "I'll do that," he answered, moving toward the preferred seat. The stewardess fussed over him a while, and then moved to her cubicle at the rear of the cabin. Floyd settled down in his seat, adjusted the safety harness around waist and shoulders, and strapped his briefcase to the adjacent seat. A moment later, the loudspeaker came on with a soft popping noise. "Good morning," said Miss Simmons' voice. "This is Special Flight 3, Kennedy 2, Space Station 1. She was determined, it seemed, to go through the full routine for her solitary passenger, and Floyd could not resist a smile as she continued inexorably. "Our transit time will be 55 minutes. Maximum acceleration will be 2G, and we will be weightless for 30 minutes. Please do not leave your seat until the safety sign is lit." Floyd looked over his shoulder and called, "Thank you." He caught a glimpse of a slightly embarrassed but charming smile. He leaned back into his seat and relaxed. This trip, he calculated, would cost the taxpayers slightly over $1 million. If it was not justified, he would be out of his job. But he could always go back to the university and to his interrupted studies of planetary formation. "Auto countdown procedures all go," the captain's voice said over the speaker with the soothing sing-song used in RT chat. "Lift off in 1 minute." As always, it seemed more like an hour. Floyd became acutely aware of the gigantic forces coiled up around him, waiting to be released, in the fuel tanks of the 2 spacecraft, and in the power storage system of the launching track was pent up the energy of a nuclear bomb, and it would all be used to take him a mere 200 miles from Earth. There was none of the old-fashioned 5-4-3-2-1-0 business. So tough on the human nervous system, launching in 15 seconds. You will be more comfortable if you start breathing deeply. That was good psychology and good physiology. Floyd felt himself well charged with oxygen and ready to tackle anything when the launching track began to sling its 1,000-ton payload out over the Atlantic. It was hard to tell when they lifted from the track and became airborne, but when the roar of the rockets suddenly doubled its fury, and Floyd found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the cushions of his seat, he knew that the first stage engines had taken over. He wished he could look out of the window, but it was an effort, even to turn his head, yet there was no discomfort. Indeed, the pressure of acceleration and the overwhelming thunder of the motors produced an extraordinary euphoria. His ears ringing, the blood pounding in his veins, Floyd felt more alive than he had for years. He was young. Again, he wanted to sing aloud, which was certainly safe, for no one could possibly hear him. The mood passed swiftly, as he suddenly realized that he was leaving Earth and everything he had ever loved. Down there were his 3 children, motherless since his wife had taken that fatal flight to Europe 10 years ago. 10 years. Impossible. Yet it was so. ... Closing parenthesis perhaps, for their sake, he should have remarried. He had almost lost sense of time when the pressure and the noise abruptly slackened, and the cabin speaker announced, preparing to separate from lower stage. Here we go. There was a slight jolt, and suddenly Floyd recalled a quotation of Leonardo da Vinci's, which he had once seen displayed in a NASA office. The great bird will take its flight on the back of the great bird, bringing glory to the nest where it was born. Well, the great bird was flying now, beyond all the dreams of Da Vinci, and its exhausted companion was winging back to Earth. In a 10,000-mile arc, the empty lower stage would glide down into the atmosphere, trading speed for distance as it homed on Kennedy. In a few hours, serviced and refueled, it would be ready again to lift another companion toward the shining silence, which it could never reach. Now, thought Floyd, we are on our own, more than halfway to orbit, when the acceleration came on again. As the upper stage rockets fired, the thrust was much more gentle. Indeed, he felt no more than normal gravity. But it would have been impossible to walk, since up was straight toward the front of the cabin. If he had been foolish enough to leave his seat, he would have crashed at once against the rear wall. This effect was a little disconcerting, for it seemed that the ship was standing on its tail. To Floyd, who was at the very front of the cabin, all the seats appeared to be fixed on a wall, topping vertically beneath him. He was doing his best to ignore this uncomfortable illusion when dawn exploded outside the ship. In seconds, they shot through veils of crimson and pink and gold and blue into the piercing white of day. Though the windows were heavily tinted to reduce the glare, the probing beams of sunlight that now slowly swept across the cabin left Floyd half-blinded. For several minutes, he was in space, yet there was no question of being able to see the stars. He shielded his eyes with his hands and tried to peer through the window beside him. Out there, the swept-back wing of the ship was blazing like white-hot metal in the reflected sunlight. There was utter darkness all around it, and that darkness must be full of stars, but it was impossible to see them. Weight was slowly ebbing. The rockets were being throttled back as the ship eased itself into orbit. The thunder of the engines dropped to a muted roar, then a gentle hiss, then died into silence. If it had not been for the restraining straps, Floyd would have floated out of his seat. His stomach felt as if it was going to do so anyway. He hoped that the pills he had been given half an hour and 10,000 miles ago would perform as per specifications. He had been spacesick just once in his career, and that was much too often. The pilot's voice was firm and confident as it came over the cabin speaker. Please observe all 0G regulations. We will be docking at Space Station 1 in 45 minutes. The stewardess came walking up the narrow corridor to the right of the closely spaced seats. There was a slight buoyancy about her steps, and her feet came away from the floor reluctantly, as if entangled in glue. She was keeping to the bright yellow band of Velcro carpeting that ran the full length of the floor and of the ceiling. The carpet and the soles of her sandals were covered with myriads of tiny hooks, so that they clung together like burrs. This trick of walking in free fall was immensely reassuring to disoriented passengers. Would you like some coffee or tea, Dr. Floyd? She asked cheerfully. No, thank you, he smiled. He always felt like a baby when he had to suck at one of those plastic drinking tubes. The stewardess was still hovering anxiously around him as he popped open his briefcase and prepared to remove his papers. Dr. Floyd, may I ask you a question? Certainly, he answered, looking up over his glasses. My fiancé's a geologist at Clavius, said Miss Simmons, measuring her words carefully, and I haven't heard from him for over a week. I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe he's away from his base and out of touch. She shook her head. He always tells me when that's going to happen, and you can imagine how worried I am with all these rumors. Is it really true about an epidemic on the moon? If it is, there's no cause for alarm. Remember, there was a quarantine back in '98 over that mutated flu virus. A lot of people were sick, but no one died, and that's really all I can say, he concluded firmly. Miss Simmons smiled pleasantly and straightened up. Well, thank you anyway, Doctor. I'm sorry to have bothered you. No bother at all, he said gallantly, but not very accurately. Then he buried himself in his endless technical reports, in a desperate last-minute assault on the usual backlog. He would have no time for reading when he got to the moon. Half an hour later, the pilot announced, "We make contact in 10 minutes. Please check your seat harness." Floyd obeyed and put away his papers. It was asking for trouble to read during the celestial juggling act which took place during the last 300 miles. Best to close one's eyes and relax while the spacecraft was nudged back and forth, with brief bursts of rocket power. A few minutes later, he caught his first glimpse of Space Station 1, only a few miles away. The sunlight glinted and sparkled from the polished metal surfaces of the slowly revolving, 300-yard diameter disk. Not far away, drifting in the same orbit, was a swept-back Theta V spaceplane, and close to that, an almost spherical Ares 1B, the workhorse of space, with the 4 stubby legs of its lunar landing shock absorbers jutting from one side. The Orion 3 spacecraft was descending from a higher orbit, which brought the Earth into spectacular view behind the station. From his altitude of 200 miles, Floyd could see much of Africa and the Atlantic Ocean. There was considerable cloud cover, but he could still detect the blue-green outlines of the Gold Coast. The central axis of the space station, with its docking arms extended, was now slowly swimming toward them. Unlike the structure from which it sprang, it was not rotating, or, rather, it was running in reverse at a rate which exactly countered the station's own spin. Thus, a visiting spacecraft could be coupled to it for the transfer of personnel or cargo without being whirled disastrously around. With the softest of thuds, ship and station made contact. There were metallic, scratching noises from outside, then the brief hissing of air as pressures equalized. A few seconds later, the airlock door opened, and a man wearing the light, close-fitting slacks and short-sleeved shirt, which was almost the uniform of space station personnel, came into the cabin. "Pleased to meet you, Dr. Floyd. I'm Nick Miller, station security. I'm to look after you until the shuttle leaves." They shook hands. Then Floyd smiled at the stewardess and said, "Please give my compliments to Captain Tynes, and thank him for the smooth ride. Perhaps I'll see you on the way home." Very cautiously, it was more than a year since he had last been weightless, and it would be some time before he regained his space legs. He hauled himself hand over hand through the airlock and into the large, circular chamber at the axis of the space station. It was a heavily padded room, its walls covered with recessed handholds. Floyd gripped one of these firmly while the whole chamber started to rotate until it matched the spin of the station. As it gained speed, faint and ghostly gravitational fingers began to clutch at him, and he drifted slowly toward the circular wall. Now he was standing, swaying back and forth gently, like seaweed in the surge of the tide, on what had magically become a curving floor. The centrifugal force of the station's spin had taken hold of him. It was very feeble here, so near the axis, but would increase steadily as he moved outward. From the central transit chamber, he followed Miller down a curving stair. At first his weight was so slight that he had almost to force himself downward by holding on to the handrail. Not until he reached the passenger lounge, on the outer skin of the great revolving disc, had he acquired enough weight to move around almost normally. The lounge had been redecorated since his last visit, and had acquired several new facilities. Besides the usual chairs, small tables, restaurant, and post office, there were now a barber shop, drugstore, movie theater, and a souvenir shop selling photographs and slides of lunar and planetary landscapes, guaranteed genuine pieces of Lunix, Rangers, and Surveyors, all neatly mounted in plastic and exorbitantly priced. Can I get you anything while we're waiting? Miller asked. We board in about 30 minutes. I could do with a cup of black coffee, 2 lumps, and I'd like to call Earth. Right, doctor, I'll get the coffee. The phones are over there. The picturesque booths were only a few yards from a barrier with 2 entrances, labeled Welcome to the US section and Welcome to the Soviet section. Beneath these were notices which read, in English, Russian and Chinese, French, German, and Spanish. Please have ready your passport, visa, medical certificate, transportation permit, weight declaration. There was a rather pleasant symbolism about the fact that as soon as they had passed through the barriers, in either direction, passengers were free to mix again. The division was purely for administrative purposes. Floyd, after checking that the area code for the United States was still 81, punched his 12-digit home number, dropped his plastic all-purpose credit card into the pay slot, and was through in 30 seconds. Washington was still sleeping, for it was several hours to dawn, but he would not disturb anyone. His housekeeper would get the message from the recorder as soon as she awoke. Miss Fleming, this is Dr. Floyd. Sorry I had to leave in such a hurry. Would you please call my office and ask them to collect the car? It's at Dulles Airport, and the key is with Mr. Bailey, Senior Flight Control Officer. Next, will you call the Chevy Chase Country Club and leave a message for the secretary? I definitely won't be able to play in the tennis tournament next weekend. Give my apologies. I'm afraid they were counting on me. Then, call Downtown Electronics and tell them that if the video in my study isn't fixed by Wednesday, can take the damn thing back. He paused for breath and tried to think of any other crises or problems that might arise during the days ahead. If you run short of cash, speak to the office. They can get urgent messages to me, but I may be too busy to answer. Give my love to the children and say, I'll be back as soon as I can. Oh, hell. Here's someone I don't want to see. I'll call from the moon if I can. Goodbye. Floyd tried to duck out of the booth, but it was too late. He had already been spotted. Bearing down on him through the Soviet section exit was Dr. Dmitry Moisevich of the USSR Academy of Science. Dmitry was one of Floyd's best friends, and for that very reason, he was the last person he wished to talk to, here and now.